Hey everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas Mirus. It's time to resume my ongoing series on the great encyclicals of Pope Leo XIII, who was so foundational, especially for the Church's social doctrine. In the first episode of the series, we discussed his encyclical on Christian philosophy. In the second one, we discussed his encyclical on liberty. And now I am going to talk about Arcanum, also called Arcanum Divinae, his encyclical on Christian marriage. So this is another really important foundational social encyclical, given that the family is the fundamental social unit the Church is teaching. I should also mention, as I've been doing with all of these Leo XIII episodes, this episode is accompanied by an article on the website catholicculture.org, which I'll link to in the show notes. And that article will be kind of a shorter summary of the major points of the encyclical, which I'll discuss at greater length in this podcast. So you can check that out if you want. As for the title, Arcanum, or Arcanum Divinae, sometimes called, those are just the first couple of words of the encyclical. They don't really refer to the subject matter, but that's how a lot of encyclicals are named, just by whatever the first couple of words happen to be in the Latin. This came out on February 10th, 1880, and it was Leo XIII's fourth encyclical. One of the reasons this document is important and foundational is, as Russell Hittinger, the great scholar of Catholic social teaching, says, it is, quote, the first formal and synoptic teaching on marriage since the Council of Trent. So, in a few hundred years. And by synoptic, he means a document giving a synopsis of the Church's teachings on marriage. I want to take a moment before I discuss the content of this encyclical to just kind of put it in context with later documents on marriage or family life more generally that have come out. So in 1880, Leo XIII promulgates this encyclical, Arcanum, and then on the 50th anniversary of this encyclical, Pius XI promulgates his encyclical on marriage, Casti Connubii. And these are still maybe surprising, but they're still the papal documents with the highest level of teaching authority that the Church has devoted specifically to marriage. So to put this in a little bit of context, mentioning some other high-profile documents that have come out since then, Familiaris Consortio by Pope St. John Paul II is pretty important. That was a post-synodal apostolic exhortation on the family. And so, being about the family, it of course included stuff about marriage, but alongside a lot of other social concerns and reflections. Then another post-synodal apostolic exhortation on the family by Pope Francis, Amoris Laetitia, but that one is less purely doctrinal and has a much more pastoral bent, and controversially so, of course. And then probably the other most famous kind of high-level magisterial document on dealing with issues related to marriage or within marriage is, of course, Pope St. Paul VI's Humanae Vitae. And that deals with an aspect of marital morality, but it's not a general teaching of what the Church, believes about marriage. You might also wonder about John Paul II's theology of the body, which is amazing, but it's about a lot more than just marriage. And it's also, as a series of Wednesday audiences, it's very, very low-level magisterium. Because of how brilliant it is, it's sort of punched way above its magisterial weight in terms of influence on Catholic thought. But, for example, it's not even included in the Actae Apostolicae Sedis, which are the official records of the papal magisterium for each year. The Wednesday audiences are just not included in those generally. And also, John Paul II actually wrote it before he became pope. So while it is, as promulgated by him once he became pope, it is sort of papal teaching, but it still is written often with the tone of a theologian's speculative reflections. It's also very, very long. So I don't want to sound like I'm, dismissing theology of the body or its importance, but I'm just talking specifically in terms of a magisterial document that is sort of dedicated in a focused way to here's what the Church teaches about marriage. There haven't actually been a ton of those at the highest level of magisterium that are really specifically focused in that way, which is perhaps surprising because the Church has talked so much about marriage, not only in documents about marriage, but in documents about society in general, in this whole era of Catholic social teaching, starting with Leo XIII and continuing into our day. So now just to compare Arcanum and Casti Connubii to give you a sense of the differences between the two. This episode's about Arcanum, but if I were to recommend that every Catholic read a single church document on marriage, it would easily be Casti Connubii, because it's a compact statement of what the church teaches about marriage, and it's also both old enough to reiterate aspects of marriage that a lot of modern church authorities have sort of avoided talking about because they're not so palatable to modern people. But it's also recent enough to explain those aspects in a way that is very sensitive to modern concerns. It's really about marriage itself, its ends, and how it should be lived. And I think it's the most essential magisterial document on marriage. And on our sister podcast, Catholic Culture Audiobooks, we have an audiobook of Casti Connubii by Pius XI, so I will link to that in the show notes as well, and you should definitely check that out. Okay, so what's the difference between Casti Connubii and Arcanum? Arcanum has some stuff about what marriage is in itself and how it should be lived, quite a bit about that actually, but it has a particular lens through which it looks at those things. It looks at them primarily through the lens of what the church has done to uplift and protect marriage throughout history. And Leo spends a lot of time arguing for why the state has no right to usurp the church's governance over marriage. So this is something that was very relevant at the time and still is today, really. But those looking for, you can find good stuff about how to live marriage in Arcanum, but if you're looking for something about how to live marriage, I would go instead to Casti Connubii primarily. But if you're looking at something with how marriage relates to the authority of the church and the authority of the government, and what the church's attitude towards marriage has been throughout history, I think Arcanum is a great one too. And again, it's very significant because it's the first of these two, and it sets the foundation for what Pius XI does in Casti Connubii. So still very much worth reading in itself. I'll also add, in terms of how marriage should be lived, both of these documents, but speaking of Arcanum, there's stuff in there that would challenge, feminists, for instance, but there's also quite a bit, perhaps a surprising amount, that would challenge some of the kind of masculinity influencers online as well. And we'll get into that in terms of how the church uplifted the moral standards of marriage and the standards of dignity for women in marriage by comparison with pagan societies. Okay, so let's get into it. Leo XIII, Arcanum, and he starts out situating marriage in terms of the mission of Christ to renew and reestablish all things in himself. And this is chiefly in the order of grace, but Leo is also very much going to emphasize that Christ and the church also do much to uplift marriage, even in the order of nature itself, with a proper understanding of what marriage is in its essence, even as a natural institution. And part of the reason he emphasizes that what the church does for marriage, even in the order of nature, is because he's fighting against this tendency to either throw off the authority of church over marriage altogether. So he's arguing for why this is really foolhardy, because marriage has derived so many benefits from the protection and the governance of the church throughout history. But also he's arguing for why ultimately in the case of sacramental marriage, you can't separate sort of the natural marriage from the sacramental marriage, and therefore the church really has authority over both, because some people will try to kind of split the governance of marriage between the church and the state in ways that that Leo says is unacceptable. Okay, so on this point, he says we have to beware the temptation of seeing Christianity as a means to achieving worldly goods, but still we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which it does actually benefit our life in this world. So to quote Leo for the first time here, the Christian religion thought of and provided for all things which are held to be advantageous in a state, so much so indeed that, according to St. Augustine, one cannot see how it could have offered greater help in the matter of living well and happily had it been instituted for the single object of procuring or increasing those things which contributed to the convenience or advantages of this mortal life. So he's going to talk a bit about kind of the history of the institution of marriage, starting out with its origin before the fall in the Garden of Eden. And I'm going to quote him at length here. "We record what is to all known and cannot be doubted by any, that God, on the 6th day of creation, having made man from the slime of the earth and having breathed into his face the breath of life, gave him a companion, whom he miraculously took from the side of Adam when he was locked in sleep." Just to stop there for a moment, this is a side point, obviously, but it's interesting. He seems to be actually saying, no, like, we all know and we can't doubt that God literally took Eve from the side of Adam while he was asleep. Like, that's not it sounds like he's saying that's not a metaphor. What is to all known and cannot be doubted by any. And this is really important, of course, for the unity of the human race. So Leo goes on, "God thus, in his most far-reaching foresight, decreed that this husband and wife should be the natural beginning of the human race, from whom it might be propagated and preserved by an unfailing fruitfulness throughout all futurity of time. And this union of man and woman, that it might answer more fittingly to the infinite wise counsels of God, even from the beginning, manifested chiefly 2 most excellent properties, deeply sealed as it were, and signed upon it, namely, unity and perpetuity." Unity and perpetuity. So those are very important aspects of marriage that the church has always guarded. He goes on, "From the gospel, we see clearly that this doctrine was declared and openly confirmed by the divine authority of Jesus Christ. He bore witness to the Jews and to his apostles that marriage from its institution should exist between 2 only, that is, between one man and one woman, that of 2 they are made, so to say, one flesh, and that the marriage bond is by the will of God so closely and strongly made fast that no man may dissolve it or rend it asunder." So this is the foundation of marriage before the fall. Then we have the fall. And Leo talks about how there was this gradual corruption of marriage, both among the pagans and even among God's chosen people, among the Jews, such as their desire for divorce, which Moses, as our Lord says, permitted because of the hardness of their hearts. But this was not God's original plan for marriage. Now, the passage where Leo talks about how marriage was corrupted with the Gentiles is very interesting, and I'm going to read this in full and make some stops along the way. "All nations seem, more or less, to have forgotten the true notion and origin of marriage, and thus everywhere laws were enacted with reference to marriage, prompted to all appearance by state reasons, but not such as nature required." So this is very interesting. Like, the very first thing he brings up is the state, for its own reasons, makes laws about marriage, but these laws are not warranted by the nature of marriage. There are these kind of added restrictions on who can marry, for instance, or on the rights of people within marriage, and allow, immoral things in marriage. So his focus is really here on guarding marriage against these state encroachments. Okay, so to go on, solemn rights, invented at the will of the lawgivers, brought about that women should, as might be, bear either the honorable name of wife or the disgraceful name of concubine. And things came to such a pitch that permission to marry, or the refusal of the permission, depended on the will of the heads of the state, whose laws were greatly against equity, or even to the highest degree unjust. So the church also has this concern about the freedom of people to marry each other. I mean, an example, obviously, in modern, not currently, obviously, but in the relatively recent past, say in the United States, would be laws against racially mixed marriages and stuff like that. Those would be laws greatly against equity in Pope Leo's terms, because they're refusing. People have this natural right to marry, adults. If they're sort of naturally eligible to marry each other, the state can't stop them from doing that. Moreover, plurality of wives and husbands, as well as divorce, caused the nuptial bond to be relaxed exceedingly. Hence, too, sprang up the greatest confusion as to the mutual rights and duties of husbands and wives, inasmuch as a man assumed right of dominion over his wife, ordering her to go about her business, often without any just cause, while he was himself at liberty, and here he's quoting St. Jerome, to run headlong with impunity into lust, unbridled and unrestrained, in houses of ill fame and amongst his female slaves, as if the dignity of the person sinned with, and not the will of the sinner, made the guilt. So I think that's very interesting. He talks about the man assuming right of dominion over his wife. Now, later in this, he does talk about the wife's obligation to obey her husband. So he's not saying that that's bad, but this dominion is something more. It's kind of this arbitrary and tyrannical exercise of authority, as well as a kind of a moral double standard. It's an interesting line, and I'm not quite sure what sort of thing he has in mind when he says a man assumed right of dominion over his wife, ordering her to go about her business, often without any just cause. But I think that's interesting because some of the kind of, online masculinity influencers do speak about the church's doctrine of obedience in marriage as though it's like impossible for a husband to be tyrannical, as though the husband should just be, can just totally micromanage his wife in every detail of her life, and sort of treat her like a child. But that is not the case. As Pius XI actually goes into this more explicitly in Casti Connubii. But the particular target here is this kind of moral double standard between wives and husbands. And on that point, again, Tim Gordon said on a recent live stream that wives have to be good wives in order to be good women, but men don't have to be good husbands in order to be good men. And I really don't think that Leo XIII would agree with that statement. Again, Tim said that wives have to be good wives in order to be good women, but men don't have to be good husbands in order to be good men. I think that's Pope Leo XIII, given his attacks on sort of moral double standards within marriage. I think he would say that a bad husband is a bad man just as much as a bad wife is a bad woman. So to continue with Leo, when the licentiousness of a husband thus showed itself, nothing could be more piteous than the wife sunk so low as to be all but reckoned as a means for the gratification of passion or for the production of offspring. So, again, I'm not trying to sound like some kind of woke feminist here. You guys know, if you've been listening for a while, I do a lot of episodes against feminism. I've written quite a bit about that. But, I mean, it is quite striking, this line, again, because, you hear this accusation from secular people and feminists that, the church's teaching on contraception and stuff like that. Oh, that just means that you see women just as breeders and you see that they're only good for making babies and nothing else. And, as an attack on the church's teaching on contraception and things like that, that's obviously just a lie, a slander. Most Catholics don't think that way at all. As far as, the production of offspring is, I think it's probably more common for people to use their spouses as a means for the gratification of passion today than it is to just use them as a mere means for the production of offspring. But I mean, Leo does warn against this. So it is possible to see your wife as a mere breeder, so to speak, even if that is not the most common thing today. So it is worth keeping in mind. So he goes on, without any feeling of shame, marriageable girls were bought and sold like so much merchandise, and power was sometimes given to the father and to the husband to inflict capital punishment on the wife. Of necessity, the offspring of such marriages as these were either reckoned among the stock and trade of the commonwealth, or held to be the property of the father of the family, and the law permitted him to make and unmake the marriages of his children at his mere will, and even to exercise against them the monstrous power of life and death. And he's talking about things like the Roman concept of the paterfamilias. So that's his long paragraph describing the different ways in which marriage was corrupted among the Gentiles. And so the two biggest things seem to be the state being overbearing and regulating marriage, and then, the kind of overbearing patriarchy. And I'm pro-patriarchy, but there is obviously a bad form of it. And it's just striking that Leo sort of focuses his discussion so much on that the moral double standard between men and women in marriage being bad, and the excessive authority, tyrannical authority of the husband and the father in pagan marriages. So this is something that the church corrects, chiefly by uplifting the women and insisting on moral behavior by the man. So we've got this bad situation, and of course, Jesus brought the remedy to this. He honored the marriage of Cana with his presence and his first public miracle. He condemned the polygamous and divorcing customs of the Jews. He taught that God himself made marriage indissoluble, and he established a divine law that defines divorce and remarriage as a form of adultery. And then Leo says that the doctrine of the sacrament of marriage is even more fully laid out by the apostles, especially St. Paul in Ephesians 5, where he explains marriage as a type of the union between Christ and the church. And the apostles explained that marriage now had an even higher purpose than its merely natural one. And I quote Leo here. He quotes, within this quote, he quotes Ephesians 5, and he quotes the Roman Catechism. By the command of Christ, marriage not only looks to the propagation of the human race, but to the bringing forth of children for the church, fellow citizens with the saints and the domestics of God, Ephesians 5, so that, quote, a people might be born and brought up for the worship and religion of the true God and our Savior, Jesus Christ. That's the Roman Catechism. And the apostles also laid out the duties and rights of husband and wife. And here I'll quote Leo again, summarizing these duties. They are bound, namely, to have such feelings for one another as to cherish always very great mutual love, to be ever faithful to their marriage vow, and to give one another an unfailing and unselfish help. The husband is the chief of the family and the head of the wife. The woman, because she is flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone, must be subject to her husband and obey him, not indeed as a servant, but as a companion, so that her obedience shall be wanting in neither honor nor dignity. Since the husband represents Christ, and since the wife represents the church, let there always be, both in him who commands and in her who obeys, a heaven-born love guiding both in their respective duties. For, he quotes St. Paul, the husband is the head of his wife, as Christ is the head of the church. Therefore, as the church is subject to Christ, so also let wives be to their husbands in all things. This bit about obedience in marriage is quoted by Pius XI later on, 50 years later, in Casti Connubii, and he expands on what this looks like significantly. So I highly recommend, even if you don't read the whole of Casti Connubii, check out that passage, because it's a very important reference for us to understand how this works and certain qualifications and limits that are put on it. He also mentions, the apostles laying out the duties of children. Children have to honor and obey their parents. Parents have to carefully educate and bring up their children in virtue and holiness. Now, he also talks, and this is sort of getting to the central point of the encyclical, about how Christ entrusted the care and the discipline of marriage to his church, and there are examples of this from the very beginning. And I'll quote a couple of these sections where Leo talks about the early history of the church's regulation of marriage. Quote, that the judgment of the Council of Jerusalem reprobated licentious and free love we all know, as also that the incestuous Corinthian was condemned by the authority of blessed Paul. Again, in the very beginning of the Christian church, were repulsed and defeated, with the like unremitting determination, the efforts of many who aimed at the destruction of Christian marriage, such as the Gnostics, Manichaeans, and Montanists, and in our own time, Mormons, St. Simonians, Phalansterians, and Communists. And if you're interested in who some of those people were, there's a footnote in the actual encyclical. But some of these were people who allowed for, certain license and morality in marriage, and others condemned marriage altogether, such as the Montanists. Very early on, he says that the church's laws gave equal rights to everybody to enter into marriage. The church abolished distinction between slaves and free men and women with regard to being able to marry each other. It asserted that the rights of husbands and wives are equal in regard to fidelity, mutual affection, and marital duties. It asserted the dignity of the woman, and it forbade the man to inflict capital punishment for his wife's adultery or to commit adultery himself. To quote him on more regulations on marriage by the church, it is also a great blessing that the church has limited, so far as is needful, the power of fathers of families, so that sons and daughters wishing to marry are not in any way deprived of their rightful freedom. In other words, fathers cannot stop their sons and daughters of, who have reached the age of majority from marrying. that for the purpose of spreading more widely the supernatural love of husbands and wives, she has decreed marriages within certain degrees of consanguinity or affinity to be null and void. In other words, legislation against, what counts as incest, essentially. She has taken the greatest pains to safeguard marriage as much as is possible from error and violence and deceit, that she has always wished to preserve the holy chasteness of the marriage bed, the security of persons, the honor of husband and wife, and the sanctity of religion. So, getting to the point now here, I would say that the most continuous point that Leo makes in this encyclical about marriage and the church and the state. So people today, we know people today are rebelling against God. They attack the very nature of marriage. One thing, though, we've gotten more used to, which Leo condemned in his time, is the undermining of the jurisdiction of the church over marriage. And at the time of Leo, these sort of revolutionaries in this matter were seeking to bring marriage completely under the regulation of the civil authority and remove it from the church's authority. And this is an area where it seems like there's really no way of having just laws without the explicit recognition of the authority of the church, because otherwise conflict is inevitable, because the civil power will, for instance, try to dissolve marriages that the church says cannot be dissolved, or at least if not divorce people, then the civil power will pretend the ability to grant annulments and things like that, which it has no right to do. So I think this is one of those sort of areas where I've mentioned this, I think, on previous podcasts, where the rubber really hits the road in terms of church-state relations and the need to have sort of an explicit and positive harmony between them, rather than this kind of like, oh, we don't interfere in your sphere and you don't interfere in ours, because there just are overlapping interests when it comes to marriage and education. These are two of, I've mentioned this before, these are two of the chief areas in the classical social encyclicals where the church expresses this concern. Okay, so Leo says, hence are owing civil marriages, commonly so called. Hence laws are framed which impose impediments to marriage. Hence arise judicial sentences affecting the marriage contract as to whether or not it has been rightly made. Lastly, all power of prescribing and passing judgment in this class of cases is, as we see, of set purpose denied to the Catholic Church. He goes on to argue, and this is a super interesting passage, that there's something innately religious about marriage. Even marriage that is not sacramental in the Christian sense can never be purely a profane matter because God made it. And he says that also in its very origins, it foreshadowed the incarnation of the Son of God. So he quotes a bit about this. Innocent III, therefore, and Honorius III, our predecessors, affirmed not falsely nor rashly that a sacrament of marriage existed ever amongst the faithful and unbelievers. We call to witness the monuments of antiquity, as also the manners and customs of those people who, being the most civilized, had the greatest knowledge of law and equity. In the minds of all of them, it was a fixed and foregone conclusion that, when marriage was thought of, it was thought of as conjoined with religion and holiness. Hence, among those, marriages were commonly celebrated with religious ceremonies under the authority of pontiffs and with the ministry of priests. So mighty, even in the souls ignorant of heavenly doctrine, was the force of nature, of the remembrance of their origin, and the conscience of the human race. As then, marriage is holy by its own power, in its own nature, and of itself, it ought not to be regulated and administered by the will of civil rulers, but by the divine authority of the Church, which alone in sacred matters professes the office of teaching. So that's very interesting. So he says not even just Christian marriage is something sacred in itself and should not be regulated by the will of civil rulers, but by the church, because the church has authority over all sacred things. That's a very strong claim for the church's authority, not just over the marriages of professed Catholics, although that is, most important here. Next, he says, the dignity of the sacrament must be considered, for through addition of the sacrament, the marriages of Christians have become far the noblest of all matrimonial unions. But to decree and ordain concerning the sacrament is, by the will of Christ himself, so much a part of the power and duty of the Church that it is plainly absurd to maintain that even the very smallest fraction of such power has been transferred to the civil ruler. He makes more lengthy historical arguments that the marriage laws given by Christ and the apostles did not depend one iota upon the authority of secular rulers. They were very often in conflict in the first centuries of the church. So he gives these examples. The law of the church was sometimes so divergent from the civil law that Ignatius the Martyr, Justin, Athenagoras, and Tertullian publicly denounced as unjust and adulterous certain marriages which had been sanctioned by imperial law. As time went on, the church continued to regulate marriage independently even of the Christian emperors. So there's some interesting history here that I'll read. It is well known that with respect to the impediments arising from the marriage bond, through vow, disparity of worship, blood relationship, certain forms of crime, and from previously plighted troth, many decrees were issued by the rulers of the church at the councils of Granada, Arles, Chalcedon, the Second of Melevum, and others, which were often widely different from the decrees sanctioned by the laws of the empire. Furthermore, so far were Christian princes from arrogating any power in the matter of Christian marriage, that they on the contrary acknowledged and declared that it belonged exclusively in all its fullness to the church. In fact, Honorius, the younger Theodosius, and Justinian also hesitated not to confess that the only power belonging to them in relation to marriage was that of acting as guardians and defenders of the holy canons. If at any time they enacted anything by their edicts concerning impediments of marriage, they voluntarily explained the reason, affirming that they took it upon themselves so to act by leave and authority of the church, whose judgment that they were wont to appeal to and reverently to accept in all questions that concerned legitimacy and divorce. Legitimacy meaning legitimacy of children. As also in all those points which in any way have a necessary connection with the marriage bond. The Council of Trent, therefore, had the clearest right to define that it is in the church's power, quote, to establish diriment impediments of matrimony, and that matrimonial causes pertain to ecclesiastical judges. But, some people might ask, couldn't the natural or the civil aspects of marriage be distinguished from the sacrament, so that then the state would have authority over the natural parts of marriage or the civil aspects and the church over the latter? And Leo says a loud no to that question. Quote, let no one then be deceived by the distinction which some civil jurists have so strongly insisted upon, the distinction namely by virtue of which they sever the matrimonial contract from the sacrament with intent to hand over the contract to the power and will of the rulers of the state, while reserving questions concerning the sacrament of the church. A distinction, or rather severance of this kind cannot be approved. For certain it is that in a Christian marriage the contract is inseparable from the sacrament, and for this reason the contract cannot be true and legitimate without being a sacrament as well. For Christ our Lord added to marriage the dignity of a sacrament, but marriage is the contract itself whenever that contract is lawfully concluded. Hence we have the Church's doctrine that when two baptized persons are validly married, they are sacramentally married. And this is a side note, and I'm not going to express a strong opinion on this because there may well be factors of which, or legal things of which I'm ignorant. But from what I understand, at least in America, most every diocese in their annulment, their marriage tribunals, they either require or at least encourage the couple to have already gotten a civil divorce before even having a hearing at the marriage tribunal. And I had to be fair, I had a conversation with a canon lawyer recently where he sort of explained some of the practical reasons for this, and that, it's if the couple hasn't already had a civil divorce, it's kind of a sign that they're not really serious about, seeking an annulment case. But still, something about this just doesn't sit right with me, given that the church says that the state has no right to, annul or divorce these Christian marriages, these sacramental marriages, that the church should allow people to get a civil divorce, let alone encourage it before the church has decided whether or not that the marriage validly took place or not. Given that the validity of the marriage is always presumed unless proven otherwise by the church, there's something a bit troubling about that. In fact, in canon law, even now, there's an expectation that you get permission from your bishop to separate from your spouse unless the danger to you and your children is so immediate that you just need to get out of there right away before you can have a chance to talk to your bishop about it. I suppose it's possible that, some people will get permission to separate from their bishop because they have reason to believe the marriage is invalid, and then they get the civil divorce, and then they do the formal annulment proceeding. But it just seems like kind of a mess. And from what I understand, generally that expectation of getting permission from your bishop to separate from your spouse is widely overlooked. It's like now there's a tacit encouragement, it seems to me, in the way the system is run, a tacit encouragement of couples to kind of have already given up on their marriage before they even know whether it was a valid marriage or not, before they even have permission from the church to treat it as though it were an invalid marriage, even though that hasn't been determined yet. So it is troubling, and one of these things that may need to be reformed, although there seems to be not much interest in doing that. Anyway, so I want to read a little bit more from Leo about the unity between sort of the sacrament and the natural marriage in Christian marriage. Quote, "Marriage, moreover, is a sacrament, because it is a holy sign which gives grace, showing forth an image of the mystical nuptials of Christ with the Church. But the form and image of these nuptials is shown precisely by the very bond of that most close union in which man and woman are bound together in one, which bond is nothing else but the marriage itself. Hence it is clear that among Christians, every true marriage is in itself and by itself a sacrament, and that nothing can be further from the truth than to say that the sacrament is a certain added ornament or outward endowment which can be separated and torn away from the contract at the caprice of man. Neither, therefore, by reasoning can it be shown, nor by any testimony of history be proved, that power over the marriages of Christians has ever lawfully been handed over to the rulers of the state." So he goes on to say that, building on his point at the very beginning of the encyclical, that the church's regulation of marriage is not only good for, the soul, or good for, our the spiritual good, the supernatural good of people, but it's also good for sort of the natural and the material goods of individuals and the public good, because, there's so many reasons why marriage is a good thing for society, not just because of the propagation of the human race, as he puts it, but also to make the lives of the people who are married better and happier, their mutual aid, their love, having things in common, and the grace coming from the sacrament, the good of families, the education of children, sacrament of marriage, as he mentions, tempering the authority of the father by the example of the divine authority, as he puts it, and, encouraging children to obey their parents, etc. But then when marriage is detached from the church, it loses these benefits and becomes enslaved to the passions. He says that without the fear of God and the refreshment and comfort of the Christian faith, it often happens that the mutual services and duties of marriage seem almost unbearable, and then whatever difficulties arise, the spouses want to be set free of their vows, and they also want to change the laws of society in order to do so. So he goes on to talk then in detail about the evils of divorce. So he's not just talking about the evils of when a divorce happens, but the evils of divorce even being an option, even being conceivable in society. Quote, "Matrimonial contracts are by it made variable, mutual kindness is weakened, deplorable inducements to unfaithfulness are supplied, harm is done to the education and training of children, occasion is afforded for the breaking up of homes, the seeds of dissension are sown among families, the dignity of womanhood is lessened and brought low, and women run the risk of being deserted after having ministered to the pleasures of men." We might also mention today, men run the risk of being deserted and, having to still pay for the livelihoods of their wives and children even after not being able to live with them anymore. And Leo makes this point that once you start tolerating divorce at all, you really can't restrain its use within any bounds, because the very possibility of divorce, it just makes people desire divorce more. Like when you go into marriage with the idea that marriage is dissoluble, even if you personally intend and sincerely vow never to dissolve your marriage, that you intend your marriage to be lifelong, right? That would be a valid marriage. You intend your marriage to be lifelong. But if you are under the impression still that in theory it could be dissolved, that still will affect your mindset when you come into difficulties in your marriage. It really changes everything. Even if you start out your marriage intending to be forever bound together. And, Leo gives examples of places in which divorce was allowed only in select circumstances, but that quickly turned into a very common practice in ancient Rome. He mentions modern Protestant countries like Germany and America, and even some Catholic countries where that unfortunately happened at times. And so in this context, he says the church really deserves a lot of credit for defending the indissolubility of marriage. Quote, having branded with anathema the baneful heresy obtaining among Protestants touching divorce and separation, also for having in many ways condemned the habitual dissolution of marriage among the Greeks, meaning the Orthodox, who have a different view of divorce and remarriage than Catholics do. For having declared invalid all marriage contracted among the understanding that they may be at some future time dissolved, and lastly, for having from the earliest times repudiated the imperial laws which disastrously favored divorce. And he gives a bunch of examples of popes standing firm against rulers who wanted the church to grant them a divorce. The most famous example to us probably being, Henry VIII. He mentions Clement VII and Paul III denying him a divorce. So Leo calls for, a harmonious relation between the state and the church with regard to the regulation of marriage. And he furthermore calls for all Catholics to be well catechized about the divine establishment of marriage and the church's authority over it. And a few specific things he says it's really important for Catholics to understand. All ought to understand clearly that if there be any union of a man and woman among the faithful of Christ, which is not a sacrament, such union has not the force and nature of a proper marriage, that, although contracted in accordance with the laws of the state, it cannot be more than a rite or custom introduced by the civil law. So earlier I said, if it is a natural marriage, a valid marriage among Christians, it is a sacramental marriage, but it goes both ways. In other words, if you don't follow the regulations of sacramental marriage by the church as Christians, then you can't enter into even a natural marriage. Goes on. Further, the civil law can deal with and decide those matters alone which in the civil order spring from marriage, and which cannot possibly exist, as is evident, unless there be a true and lawful cause of them, that is to say, the nuptial bond. So what he's saying there, I think, is that the civil law can regulate some things having to do with marriage, but not sort of marriage itself. It can't regulate independently, or it can't regulate against the will of the church, things having to do with what makes a marriage, annulling marriages and things like that, who has the right to marry, those kinds of things. It can regulate things having to do with the sort of the downstream aspects of marriage, but which presume that the marriage does actually exist, such as probably laws I would imagine having to do with inheritance, or the sort of the management of finances and property between husbands and wives, and things like that are things that the state certainly could regulate it. But those all presume that the state is taking for granted what the church says about what makes for a real marriage in the first place. And to go on, he says, it should be further known that no power can dissolve the bond of Christian marriage whenever this has been ratified and consummated, and that, of a consequence, those husbands and wives are guilty of a manifest crime who plan for whatever reason to be united in a second marriage before the first one has been ended by death. When indeed matters have come to such a pitch that it seems impossible for them to live together any longer, then the church allows them to live apart, and strives at the same time to soften the evils of this separation by such remedies and helps as are suited to their condition, yet she never ceases to endeavor to bring about a reconciliation, and never despairs of doing so. But these are extreme cases, and they would seldom exist if men and women entered into the married state with proper dispositions, not influenced by passion, but entertaining right ideas of the duties of marriage and its noble purpose. Neither would they anticipate their marriage by a series of sins drawing down upon them the wrath of God, meaning, having relations before marriage. Very striking, where he says, when spouses unfortunately have to be separated, they have a valid marriage, but they're separated, the church never ceases to endeavor to bring about reconciliation and never despairs of doing so. And frankly, I wish I could say that this seemed evidently true, that this is how the church behaves, because today that doesn't seem to be the case. There doesn't seem to be a lot of kind of like direct pastoral care by, the church's authority in encouraging separated spouses to get back together, and sort of, even telling them at times when they may be obligated to do so, because spouses can't separate from each other. Not only can they not get divorced, period, if they have a valid marriage, but they can't separate if there's not a really grave reason for doing so. And if that grave reason goes away, then there would be a certain obligation to get back together, because they made vows to each other. Even if they don't have children, for the sake of the children thing is in a sense secondary, because they didn't make vows to their children, they made vows to each other. But again, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't seem like the church is really on the ball, with this on the local level. Whatever sort of generalized statements it encourages may be made. So that's rather sad. And then, some good counsels for married couples here, or people considering marriage. He emphasizes the importance of dependence on God. And again, this connects to the church's protection of marriage. He says, there would be a calm and quiet constancy in marriage if married people would gather strength and life from the virtue of religion alone, which imparts to us resolution and fortitude. For religion would enable them to bear tranquilly and even gladly the trials of their state, such as, for instance, the faults that they discover in one another, the difference of temper and character, the weight of a mother's cares, the wearing anxiety about the education of children, reverses of fortune, and the sorrows of life. One final point here that I think is important, because it has to do with Leo's theme, but also with something that the church isn't quite as strict about, as I understand it, in present church discipline. It has to do with mixed marriages. Not racially mixed marriages, but marriages between Catholics and non-Catholics, whether that be people who are not Christian at all or non-Catholic Christians. And Leo warns, as the church always has, and St. Paul warns very strongly against this. Quote, care also must be taken that they do not easily enter into marriage with those who are not Catholics. For when minds do not agree as to the observances of religion, it is scarcely possible to hope for agreement in other things. Other reasons also proving that persons should turn with dread from such marriages are chiefly these: that they give occasion to forbidden association and communion in religious matters, endanger the faith of the Catholic partner, are hindrance to the proper education of the children, and often lead to a mixing up of truth and falsehood, and to the belief that all religions are equally good. If your faith is the most important thing to you, as it should be, and if you truly understand that the greatest purpose of marriage, as Leo says earlier in this encyclical, is to raise up saints for the kingdom of God in all eternity, you are really not going to want to marry someone who is not a Catholic. Even a Christian who's not Catholic, it's going to be a big problem, aside from, as he mentions, the confusion to the proper education of the children and the belief that all religions are equally good, and the sort of the risk of sort of illicit interreligious activities, which are much more tolerated than they should be today, in terms of sort of taking part in the prayers of other religions, even other Christian religions. There's just the fact that the other spouse, the non-Catholic spouse, is lacking the assistance of the sacraments. If it's another Christian, they'll have the assistance of baptism, and the assistance of the sacrament of marriage, but not of the Eucharist, not of a Catholic prayer life, not of confession. What if they fall into mortal sin? How are they going to get out of mortal sin? You're going to be stuck without the sacrament of confession or perfect contrition. You're going to be stuck with a spouse who doesn't have grace flowing through them at all times because they're in mortal sin, and they can't easily remedy that with confession. obviously, even with a non-sacramental marriage, so much the worse, because you now as a Catholic don't even have the assistance of the sacrament. And it sort of really raises the question. There may be grave reasons. I'm not sure what they would be. There may be grave reasons for the church to make exceptions for this, as she sometimes does. But to me, it sort of raises the question, and I'm not intending to upset anybody who is married to a non-Catholic here, but this is the wisdom of the church, so we just have to say it without without fear. Is it kind of raises the question of like, what is the purpose of getting married if not to bring your spouse and your children to heaven for all eternity? To me, there's really no point. I would rather not be married than even marry a Catholic who, wasn't serious about the spiritual life, let alone a non-Catholic. So I think it's important to emphasize this at a time when I think this topic is approached more cavalierly. I know people who are in mixed marriages, and it's very painful. One of the spouses wants to contracept, for instance. It's a horrible situation to be in. And I know people whose marriages have fallen apart for that reason. People who, in some cases, weren't Catholic when they married a non-Catholic, and then they became Catholic, or have stayed in the marriage with their non-Catholic spouse, but there's many great difficulties about it. So it can happen, but you can't really take for granted that those kinds of success stories will happen. So you have to be very careful here. I think a dispensation is still required, but I think the church used to be more strict about this. And on this point, I'll also take the opportunity to read a quote from another encyclical by Leo, Quod Multum, from 1886, which is an encyclical letter to the bishops of Hungary on the liberty of the church. And I read this. I decided I'm not going to cover this in the podcast because I don't think it's worth doing a full episode on by itself in terms of anything that isn't already covered in these other encyclicals I'm discussing. But the passage on religiously mixed marriages is worth reading. He encourages the bishops to remind the faithful, quote, that even for the gravest of reasons, it is not permitted to enter into marriage with Christians who are not Catholics. Those who do so without the authority and indulgence of the church sin before God and the church. Nor can marriage succeed, he goes on a little bit later, except under the care of God and the church. Deprived of such care and entered upon contrary to the will of God, matrimony is reduced to the service of various passions, is deprived of necessary heavenly aids, and is despoiled of that common life, which is of greatest concern to man, i.e., religion. Of necessity, it produces bitter fruit to the great harm of the family and of the state. For this reason, we must commend those Catholic men who, when the Legislative Assembly of Hungary was asked 2 years ago whether it would consider the marriage of Christians with Jews valid, rejected the proposal unanimously and freely, and succeeded in having the old marriage law retained. Their vote received the approval of the vast majority of people from all parts of Hungary, proving with admirable testimony that the people thought and felt as they did. Now, to be clear, again, this is not an anti-miscegenation law, a racial mixed marriage law. This is a marriage about a law about intermarriage between religious Christians and Jews who are not Christians. So if you are in a mixed marriage, that has been approved by the church, given you've been given a dispensation to do that. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, is the point, but consider the reasons why the church has frowned upon this, generally speaking, so that you can take seriously your duty to pray for your spouse, to be an exemplary Christian in your marriage, in the hopes of winning over your spouse for Christ, or the fullness of the Catholic faith, as St. Peter says in the New Testament. He talks about wives winning over their unbelieving husbands without a word by, their piety and modesty and humility and everything. So that's very, very important. It's important not only for the salvation of your spouse, but for the proper religious upbringing of your children. Consider this as a very grave duty to do our best to sacrifice and pray and become holy for the sake of the conversion of your spouse and the salvation of your children. All right, well, so that's sort of the final point I wanted to touch on in Arcanum, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll link to the encyclical in the show notes, and the next encyclical I'm going to cover will be, this should be interesting, I haven't read this one before, Humanum Genus from 1884, Leo XIII on Freemasonry. This podcast has been a production of CatholicCulture.org. Go to CatholicCulture.org/newsletter to sign up for our email newsletter and see all of the great resources we have on the website on a bi-weekly basis. Thanks everybody for listening, and I will see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.